Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 10, Episode 4. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Our very special guest back on the pod for a second time is author, strategist, and as Scott Galloway might describe him, one of the clearest blue flame thinkers in the business today, Rishad Tobaccowala, talking about his new book, released today, Rethinking Work, Seismic Changes in the Where, When, and Why. Steve, one of the things I like best about our podcast is I get to meet and talk to just such interesting people, and they make me think and really open up the aperture.
Yeah, Rishad is definitely one of those guys. He was nice enough to blurb both my books, and as folks will be reminded of, he was on the podcast way back when, I think season 1, right?
Yeah.
So quite a while ago now, 4.5 years ago or something. And as soon as I saw that he was coming out with this book, I was like, I think we should probably get him back on. And I think people will find it very, very interesting, even though it is not just about retail for sure, but lots and lots of good lessons for retailers.
Now, I just got back from your neck of the woods, Austin, doing a speaking gig. And as people are listening to the sound of your voice today, you are in a far-off land dropping some wisdom yourself. What are you up to?
Well, as I'm recording this, I'm not in a far-off land, but I will have been through Istanbul. And then I will be, the day this comes out, I will be transiting from Istanbul to Bucharest. And on Wednesday, I guess it's the 5th, February 5th, I will be speaking at a retail media event that the fine folks at Footprint AI are putting on. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my perspectives on retail trends, but also a bit about Leaders Leap, and joined on stage by a couple of friends of the pod, Andrew Lipsman, who was on a couple years ago, I guess now. Maybe we'll have him back on. And
he's in Indy now, right? He's an indie independent.
Yes, he started his own firm previously with eMarketer, and Shrish Sridhar from Microsoft Startups. So looking forward to meeting a bunch of people, seeing those folks, and exploring a little bit of Romania.
All right. Well, say hi to those folks for me, by all means. I don't think I'll make it out next week, but you will. I think I hear amazing things about Istanbul, so I want to hear all about it when you get back. By the way, just a reminder for everybody to be sure and check out our newly refreshed YouTube site, the Remarkable Retail Podcast YouTube site. Lots of fun video snippets of our conversations and other content rolling your way. New content each and every day. All right, let's get to our news of the week. A bunch of things to highlight, so let's rapid fire through it, starting with some macroeconomic news. Yeah,
just a little bit here. No doubt we'll be coming back to macroeconomic stuff as we often do, but I think particularly given some of the things going on around the world. But as expected, the U.S. Federal Reserve held interest rates steady. The commentary around that was basically that things are pretty good, but inflation remaining a bit sticky. So it's just so funny. I know I've said this a bunch of times as we've talked about what's been going on with interest rates over the past 3 years is pretty much everybody is wrong all the time. So I hesitate to say what the outlook looks like, but it definitely seems like interest rates will be coming down slowly, at least in the U.S. But the European Central Bank, cut their interest rates by 25 basis points. They were a bit more optimistic on the outlook for inflation in the European Union. And just generally, some of the economic conditions there are relatively weak compared to the United States. That sort of makes sense. I think from a retail perspective, if interest rates remain high, then certain retail segments are likely to continue to be challenged, particularly the home categories, big ticket, those sort of things. And in fact, just this last week, we got a report that U.S. home sales were the slowest they had been in several years. We're also seeing some fraying perhaps in consumer credit. Delinquencies continue to tick up a little bit. Consumers are making smaller payments. So that's usually a sign that people are getting kind of tapped out. So more to come on this, but I would say a little nerve-wracking perhaps.
I was speaking to my audience in Austin this week about the pace of change, and a Chinese company put a huge exclamation point on the pace of disruption.
Well, as we've touched on a bunch, and I really highlight in Leaders Leap, this concept of keeping pace with the speed of disruption. And I think generally we've seen that the pace continues to accelerate. I often say a lot of change is more exponential than linear, which makes it very challenging to keep up with it. But then we also see things like DeepSeek, this Chinese AI company, which really nobody, at least broadly, was talking about a week ago, suddenly releases this new AI model that they claim was developed way more cheaply than all these other OpenAI, et cetera, kind of models. You don't use the NVIDIA chips that have been in short supply, and the demand for those NVIDIA chips have really driven the NVIDIA stock to the moon. So just in a weird way, I think kind of like we saw with Shein and Temu somewhat coming out of nowhere and then becoming a big factor. Here's another Chinese player that is doing this. So anyway, as I'm sure some people followed, a lot of the tech players, the big tech players, really got hammered with their stock, and people trying to make sense of whether this is really for real, whether there was some stolen code, all this kind of stuff. But it also starts to call in question a story that we've talked about multiple times, which is just how much money Meta, Amazon, and some of the OpenAI or some of these guys are spending on these data centers to support the growth of AI. Just a quick stat that I saw this past week, Meta is planning to spend $65 billion on data centers over the next few years. Incredible. And I remember a couple of years ago, I guess, at this point, we talked about how crazy it seemed for Meta to spend $10 billion on their metaverse strategy. So those numbers now look kind of quaint. But anyway, a lot of noise here. And again, it just really emphasizes, as you say, the pace of change is so fast, and often something really disruptive comes out of almost nowhere.
Let's talk about drugs and predictions. More news on GLP. More news on GLP-1.
Well, if folks listen to my predictions, they will know that my last prediction for 2025 was companies having to brace for the Ozempic recession because of the growth of GLP-1 and other similar drugs that work in particular on helping people lose weight. So more evidence that I might be on the right track here. Hims and Hers, which is a great direct consumer brand of various prescriptions, they are going to do their first Super Bowl ad where they will be highlighting the availability of these injectable drugs. Also, in the past week or so, several more studies have come out showing how effective these GLP-1 drugs are on things like reducing depression and anxiety, a totally new indication because of some success in reducing kidney disease. And then I think it was Novo Nordisk, I might have this wrong, but one of the big players in the GLP-1 space saying that they are working on an injection that could be done just once a year rather than weekly. So that would be a pretty big innovation. So just so much going on in this arena. How fast some of these things actually get to market, get approved, that's TBD. But again, part of what I was saying with the prediction was really the bracing for it, not that we would have this radical escalation of consumer use necessarily this year, but just a lot of folks getting ready to deal with the impact of widespread usage.
Yeah, and of course we're not a pharma podcast, but its impact on everything from fashion to restaurants and beyond is just it's I don't think it can be underestimated at this point if the trend continues to go, at least safety wise, right? And cost wise, as the cost comes down, I don't think we can underestimate this trend. Let's talk about a new brand of watch. Am I going to pronounce this right? Is it Quince or Quince? How do you pronounce it? How do you think?
I think
Quince.
I think it's Quince. Yeah, I like to, and we've done this a few times, sometimes because of the guests we have on, highlight some of these interesting up and coming brands. So we were kind of on the Viore story and the On story and some other brands fairly early. Before they really broke into the retail zeitgeist. I just like to have a reason to say zeitgeist every once in a while.
Psycho Bunny
Psycho Bunny.
Psycho Bunny could fit in that too. Yeah.
Fashion File. So there's been a few.
My Teresa.
And My Teresa, yeah, for sure. So this is actually a brand that my older daughter, Elena, has really liked. for a while, and she's been saying, "Hey, you should get the founder on the show," and we're working on that. Let's just say. But anyway, the particular news this past week was that Quince has raised $120 million in a series round funding. So that's a pretty good amount of money. We didn't get the exact valuation there, but my guess is probably in the $1 billion territory. Now, Quince is online only at this point. They focus on affordable luxury products. They're pretty well known for some of their cashmere as well as leather, but they've expanded into men's, women's, a whole bunch of product categories, but growing quite quickly. A lot of buzz on the socials, and we'll see what happens with all this money. My guess is we might see them start to open some physical retail, but that was not part of the announcement. But we shall see. But I definitely think it's a brand to watch that's growing already, good size, but growing quite rapidly.
Let's talk about Starbucks. Menu choices. They're talking about reducing menu choices. They're talking about fixing the algorithm that stages drinks. They're hiring executives. Stuff is going on, right?
Right. Well, we've got a bunch of news from Starbucks, partially because they released their earnings. So first quarterly earnings since Brian Niccol took over as CEO. So we're right at the beginning of earnings season here for retailers. So for the next few weeks, we're likely to touch on a few retailers as they're reporting. So these would be all the guys that have a calendar year end or quarter end. But some signs of life. It's funny. A lot of the stories really made it sound like the turnaround was really gaining traction. But they actually reported same-store sales down 4% and an 8% decline in transactions. So that's not exactly good, but it is better than the negative trend they had been on for a while. So I guess you got to pull out of the dive to have any chance to start rising. But we're starting to get glimpses of what is part of this new strategy. You mentioned a few things. I noticed I did stop in a Starbucks this week. A lot of effort to greet people. They wrote a little message on my cup. And so I think, I saw very prominently that they had real ceramic, I guess they are, coffee cups available, which I guess had been pulled back. So a bunch of, a lot of this is kind of back to the future, right? These are things that Starbucks was known for years ago that have been pulled out. So things starting to happen. I don't know how much of this, these things we're seeing are chain wide versus things that are being tested. So I think Starbucks definitely a brand to watch, and lots of news coming from them, I suspect, over the next several months.
Let's talk about a brand that sometimes actually fits in the same category, at least mentally. LVMH, like Starbucks is seen as kind of an upper tier brand, and let's talk about LVMH. Kind of a mixed bag to kind of think about think about some of their products in their results. One of the things I'm thinking about in a whole bunch of different ways is this big trend globally to less alcohol consumption.
Right.
Whether that's a health trend or whether that's, in particular, the types of people some just don't like for religious or other reasons to drink. It's a big trend globally.
Absolutely. And LVMH, I think the last time we talked about their earnings, they were on the disappointing side. And that was a little surprising to people, but we continue to see just generally luxury being on the slower side. And I wouldn't say that their results suggested much of a turnaround yet. But as you pointed out, a ton of weakness in their spirits business. So folks might know the MH part, Moet Hennessy, sorry. So they own a bunch of champagne houses. They own a bunch of liquor houses. And that whole side of the business was very, very weak. And I suspect you're right. This is more speaking to these global trends. This is another thing that, not to make too much of the Ozempic thing, but one of the things that has been reported with GLP-1 drugs is less craving for alcohol. So I suspect that could be a bit of a contribution to those slower sales. Now, on the other hand, the specialty retailing part of LVMH did quite well. And a big part of that is Sephora, which continues to report good results. So folks might want to go back and hear our interview with Artemis Patrick, who runs Sephora North America. But very much a mixed bag. They're a little bit better than people suspected. But I would say the overall conclusion, aside from just the commentary that's really unique to LVMH with the spirits business, because most of these other luxury players don't have any have no or very little participation in that segment. I think the overall news is that luxury, both accessible as well as the very high end, appears to still be quite challenged.
Speaking of CEOs who've been on our podcast before, let's talk about the Container Store. They went into bankruptcy proceedings, but not liquidation. They went in to go reset themselves. Seems like they're coming out and have reset. And what are you hearing about their prospects?
Yeah, well, when they filed for bankruptcy, I think we had that teed up to be something we were going to talk about on the news, and then we had to cut it for a time, basically. But yes, they filed for bankruptcy. Well, they were very clearly in significant trouble starting about a year ago because they had really terrible performance. And I would say, for me anyway, quite surprising. Like I could not really get my head around how the business was that bad. I get the discretionary recession sort of backdrop. I get the home category in general is very challenging, but the business seemed to really fall off the cliff. Mm-hmm. And it did seem like some of the stuff they were doing that Satish talked to us about when he was a guest a couple of years ago seemed like it was pointed in the right direction. Yeah. And with Bed Bath & Beyond going out of business, there's not a ton of overlap with Container Store, but for some categories, there was. Yeah, and I really thought that would be a nice upside. Well, I was totally wrong about that, obviously. And they did file. But I think it's inherently a pretty solid business, but they did have a staggering amount of debt. So they are coming out of bankruptcy. They were basically able to eliminate a huge amount of that debt. That will put them in a much better position going forward. They were a publicly traded company. They will now be in private hands. So we won't be getting much information, presumably, about their operating performance. But they still have to address the fundamentals in getting that top line moving again. And that has very clearly been a big struggle for them for a year and a half. So we'll see where that goes. But at least they are living to fight another day. I don't believe they're closing any stores. They have about 100 stores. They have not announced any store closings. So they seem to be okay with their store fleet. And presumably if they wanted to walk from a bunch of leases, they would have been able to do that in bankruptcy. So I think that suggests the pretty good foundation. They just need to get out of that huge debt load.
So it would not be an episode, it seems, lately without at least a mention of Walmart. Now, this time it's in the Great White North here in Canada. New CEO coming up from Bentonville. Existing CEO is leaving. And a announcement today, last week, as you're listening to it, a $6.5 billion 5-year investment in the country. It's a big commitment for a relatively small country. Walmart's done really well here in Canada. And I must say, a vote for Canada, which has been... Well, it's been in the news lately a little too much for our liking, actually, up here.
Right, yes. I was very, I don't say I was surprised to see this announcement necessarily, but yes, huge commitment. I think we're really seeing these, sometimes they get referred to as hyperscalers, these really huge companies with great scale and scope that are executing well. They're just stepping on the gas, pressing their advantage. So clearly, they see a great opportunity in Canada, but they're making huge investments in the U.S. They've been making big investments in Mexico. So
it's not an outlier. Yeah, it's not an
No,
outlier.
they're just really firing on all cylinders. They've got the financial capacity to go big, and I would be pretty nervous if you were competing against Walmart because they are obviously. I mean, they've been a formidable force for decades, right? But I think they really are just doing so well right now and just putting pressure on just about everybody except Amazon and Costco, really.
All right. Well, that's the news for the week. Let's leave it there. And let's now get to our really fantastic interview with Rishad Tobaccowala, talking about his new book, Rethinking Work. Rishad, welcome back to the Remarkable Retail Podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing very well, and it's great to be back.
Well, you are a global traveler. Where are we finding you today? Are you in the home office or are you somewhere exotic?
Today I'm in Chicago, which for many parts of the world is considered exotic because they wonder why people live here in the cold.
It is. I do love Chicago. Being here in Toronto, the cities are very much.
They're very similar. They're very similar. The only difference is I think Toronto is a little bit more global feeling, and Chicago, because we've preserved our lakefront, is a little bit more beautiful.
Yeah, that's very astute. That's exactly what I would say. Now, listen, I'm a big fan. I've been a big fan for years. In your first book, we're going to talk about your second book. I get your Sunday email. It is my Sunday thing, but not everybody listening may know you. So tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do for a living and how you spend your time today.
Sure. So right now I'm Rishad Tobaccowala. I'm a speaker, author, and advisor who helps people see, think, and feel differently about how to grow themselves, their teams, or their business. I'm about to publish my second book called Rethinking Work. My prior career before, and I became this company of one about 6 years ago, but my prior career to this was 37 years at a company, which is a large marketing and business transformation communication company called the Publicis Group, where I was on the board and I was the chief strategist and growth officer working around the world.
And you're a podcaster now too, right? You've joined the club. Talk a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, so I have a podcast called What Next, which is available on all platforms, which began actually 4.5 years ago in the throes of COVID when I continued to advise Publicis, and Publicis Group wanted to find ways to keep all their hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of employees connected. So we created a podcast for their internal platform, and it became popular. We went from internal guests to external guests, and then from only internal access to access all over the world. And we invite different people, and Steve's going to join us too, and leaders in different fields from all over the world, just speaking about what's next in their fields.
Fantastic! I love that format. Now, speaking of format, we like I said, you've been on the pod before, but for those who perhaps missed that, and I think it's important to kind of set a bit of a framework for the discussion leading into the second book and just our discussion. Tell us a little bit about the connected ages concept that was kind of part of the Restoring the Soul of Business, your first book. What was that about, and why is it? I explained to the people why it's kind of important to understand that as I don't know if you'd call it a foundational piece, or is it set a framework for how you think about the world we live in today and what it looks like in the future?
So, we've always talked about technology, and technology has been around since the advent of fire and then the wheel. And if you think about things like the fire and the wheel, they actually helped individuals connect and communicate more. So we gathered around the fireplace to tell stories, and we could move between cities and towns using wheels. But I defined the first connected age really with the advent of the internet, which was 1993. And we connected to discover and we connected to transact as human beings. We call that e-commerce and search, also known as Amazon and Google. And I try to explain to people that these are connection companies more than they're technology companies because they allow humans to connect. In 2007, we entered the second connected age. This did not replace the first, but expanded the first. And we had 3 new forms of connections where we were now connected all the time, connected to everybody and connected to distraction. We call that social, mobile, and streaming, also known as Meta, Apple, and Netflix. So in effect, 5 of the most valuable companies until 2, 3, 4 years, 2 years ago, were all basically connection companies that allowed people to connect. Now we have entered what I believe is the third connected age, which is the way I ended my first book. And my second book actually talks about us being in the third connected age. And in the third connected age, there are 4 new forms of connection. One is data connecting to data, which is really what AI is. So AI basically is simply data connecting to data.
Right.
Second is new ways of connecting, and that could be augmented reality, voice, virtual reality, spatial computing. Third is much faster forms of connection, which are 5G, which hasn't really taken off in the US because it's not real 5G. And finally, in a world where trust breaks down, trust connections, which is blockchain, because that's mathematics. And surprisingly today, if you think about what we have today, is blockchain is big, and it's not that Bitcoin is blockchain, but we see Bitcoin at an all-time high. We basically see NVIDIA at sometimes being the most valuable stock, and that's an AI-based stock of data connecting to data or allowing data to connect to data with machines. We see people talking about meta glasses, spatial computing, that's XR. To a great extent, we haven't yet taken off on 5G, but it will be necessary to do a lot of this cloud-based computing in an AI age. So that age has come, and that has, to a certain extent, actually become a driving force about the future of work.
Interesting. A quick question, and I'll pass the mic back to Steve. Did you ever try the Apple Pro Vision, the put it on your head kind of three-dimensional next future? And I'm just kind of curious if you thought that was something that this is what I was talking about, or are they going in the right direction with that?
Yeah, so here's my underlying basic belief. I happen to be a huge fan of Apple Vision Pro, and that is because I have decided not to pay attention to two things or three things, all of which I'm in a position not to pay attention to, which is why it hasn't really taken off. First is I have not paid attention to its ridiculous price of $3,500. Okay, I bought it. I can afford to buy it. That's number one. Second is I have not paid attention to some of the disadvantages people talk about, which is low battery life or that it hurts when it's on the head. Because for God's sakes, you connect your battery to electric power. And the second is this is something that you don't stand up on. You lie down, so there's no head thing. So people are creating useless reasons for why it doesn't work. But the third and most important is I've not paid attention to Tim Cook and what Apple believes it is. Apple believes it's about spatial computing.
Right.
I believe it's about the future of video. And once you think about it that way, I prefer watching my movies with Apple Vision Pro than on an 80-inch screen. I definitely use it on all my travel. And it is the only form it does do of spatial computing is I can now have multiple screens in front of my eyes using my Apple Mac Pro. And that's what it is versus some of the stuff that they showed. But I do believe it's directionally correct, and its price will come down. It will get lighter, but it will also be a great way that in there is what we will see the next competitor to Zoom. Because for those who haven't seen it, and obviously it's expensive, but now it's becoming somewhat more available even outside the US. But for those who haven't seen it, I'm not suggesting you buy it for $3,500. You get a free 30-minute demo at an Apple store and just ask them to show you the Alicia Keys rehearsal on spatial computing. And once you see that, you'll begin to understand why where you are is not going to matter in the future of work very soon. I would say in 3 years.
I'm going to suggest there's a fourth reason, just kind of channeling Scott Galloway, which is that you're married and you're not in search of a romantic partner. So the headset is not a barrier to people being attracted to you. Perhaps.
Yeah, and
anyway.
see what basically happens, and I agree with Scott, but see, because that is Tim Cook thinks people are going to wear on their head and walk around. And my basic belief is you're going to be sitting at home,
right,
lying down in front of a computer, and at that particular stage, you don't have to go dating. And, that's the only thing. I mean, Scott is married, but he's in constant date mode, which apparently not everybody is.
He talks about it a lot.
Exactly. That's a good segue to talk about your new book, Rethinking Work, Seismic Changes in the Where, When, and Why. And I'm curious, just first of all, why this particular topic? Why now? And what do you hope readers will benefit from having experienced it?
So the why now is primarily because post-COVID, I began to understand, both with the advent of the third connected age and the societal reaction, as well as what people were doing, working in different ways from home, that there was a new generation of working that was coming, which actually went back to the way it used to be before, I would say, the Industrial Revolution. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, we all used to work at home. Okay? It was only because of the advent of factories, and we came to factories to basically work. And then as the economies of modern countries like the United States became much more knowledge worker driven, we still pretended that we were going to factories. if that made sense. And so to a great extent, my whole thing is it's pretty ridiculous that once we've all started working in different ways to actually think about where this is going. And I began to realize, and this is, Scott Galloway said, COVID didn't change anything, it accelerated stuff. I think what COVID did is it revealed that we were working in very strange ways in 2019. And we were working in 2019 pretending that we had 2002 technologies. And 1 month later, we began to realize we had 2019 technologies, which have significantly advanced by now. So the idea really was, what is happening in the world that is making work change? And so I identified these 5 big forces, and I began to realize that all of them were going to come to bear in this 2019 to 2029 time period of 10 years. So I said writing a book right in the middle in 2025 will make sense, because in effect, my basic belief is that work is going to change more between 2019 and 2029 than it has in the 50 years before.
So can you talk a little bit, we don't have time to go super deep on this, but maybe give our listeners a flavor for what these 5 forces are and why that's led you to talk about this great rethinking concept?
Absolutely. So these are the 5 forces which are all interconnected, very top line. One is societal changes, which is we've got aging populations. We have a declining population in all parts of the world excepting 7 countries. We have 5 generations at work with different mindsets. We have the rise of the individual, and we have record disengagement at work. So you take those 5 as one factor. Second is obviously technology, which we've talked about, like the third connected age technologies. The third is the rise of marketplaces, and those marketplaces could be everything from Amazon Web Services to other cloud-based services to things like Shopify and Etsy, Deal, Fiverr, Upwork, etc., where people can basically scale up and down their companies, but also individuals can find different ways to monetize what their skills are. The fourth one is that we've also reached a position where in 2025 or 2026, the rise of side work, gig work and side hustles are going to be so big that the prediction is in 2025, as many people will be doing freelance work as will be doing full-time work. And so that tipping point has come. And then the last one was COVID. And I don't believe COVID is really about where you work, but COVID is about what we think about work. What's basically happened, especially with a lot of people, we no longer are thinking about how we fit life into work, but we're thinking about how we fit work into life. And so if you take all of those 5, and they're obviously interconnected, it is dramatic. And almost anybody who believes that this is just about COVID and getting people back to the office, who have read these 5 chapters, basically say, oh my God, you've opened my mind. I now realize why we cannot pretend that everybody is like a champagne cork, and you take them out of the bottle, they swell, you can't put them back again.
So I really like your subtitle. I guess, can you just give a flavor for what is really driving the where, when, and why of work? And I guess more importantly, because we've touched on some of this already, what does that actually mean that leaders need to do differently in driving their organizations forward?
Sure. So let's think about starting with leaders, because this is very important, because I believe that eventually it's about people and talent, and therefore leadership matters. What has basically happened is, in a distributed, unbundled world, I believe talent is gaining power over capital and management, and it's spreading around the world. And as a result, leaders have to understand that we've entered the age of de-bossification, which means that people want not bosses, but they want leaders. What bosses do is they monitor, they measure, they allocate, and they delegate. What leaders do is they mentor, guide, imagine, and support, as well as make and create. So the first really is that that leadership has to change. Second is most organizational design is all wrong because organizational design has been built on certain beliefs. It has been built on that most of the employees are going to be inside the company, where increasingly they're going to be outside. The belief that most of the work is done inside the company when it's increasingly going to be done outside through partnerships and other kinds of things. A belief that management has the power and talent does not have the information, which is not true. And also the basic belief that it is the company that gives structure and people have to work for that, versus my basic belief is the company enables people to do the best they can. So it's just the models are turned outside right in organizational design, which means you're going to have to make future organizations based on change, on competitive land sets, on talent, and on scaled and networked models versus what is currently being done. And finally, we're going to be living in a world where we're going to have two types of people. We're going to have human beings and we're going to have intelligent aliens. That's the best way to think about AI. AI is not a human being, but it's not a machine. It's intelligent aliens. So what are the skills we're going to have to require both as managers and talent to work in this particular world? And to my belief, there are going to be two sets of skills. One set of skill are basically all of us are going to have to hone a six-pack of like capabilities. Individually, each of us are going to have to keep learning. So I say cognition. Second is we're going to have to connect dots in new ways, which is creativity. And third is we're going to have to reimagine things and therefore be curious. So curiosity, creativity, and cognition. But we're going to be working with each other and with these alien forms. So we're going to require collaboration. We're going to have to require learning how to convince people. So selling skills, convincing. And very important, we're going to have to learn to have a great craft in writing and presenting, which is communication. But basically, it's going to be about excellence and craft, because in this particular world, mediocre is going to be done by machines. So in effect, we all are going to have to think about that in a very big way. And then the other one, which I think is also very, very interesting, is we're going to have to be very comfortable with working in a fragmented workplace with personalized products and services, all kinds of different types of employees, freelance, full-time, what I call fractionalized contract around the world, and how to lead them. And therefore, the emphasis is really going to be on in-person interaction where possible versus putting people back into the office, but much more about growing people through storytelling, connecting dots, and empathy versus a lot of current skills.
A lot of these things you've been talking about in one way, shape, or another since I first met you. I have a question for you. Does anything ever surprise you? Did anything surprise you when you were writing the book? You're like, I did not think of that, or you came across something that shocked you. Are you ever surprised?
Yeah, always. I think to me, life surprises because that's what it is. But what tends to happen is I'm not surprised on certain things, which are these broad trends, because I was early in, I guess, both understanding them as well as aligning my career with them. But I will give you, like, for instance, when writing the book, 4 pieces of surprise, which while I was writing the book, I began to realize. The first one that I began to realize is that 2 out of every 3 people who have a full-time job and who are Gen Z, either in Asia or in the United States, have a side gig or side hustle with which they make money.
Wow.
Just imagine 2 out of 3 people who have a full-time job who are less than 35 years old have a side gig or side hustle with which they make money. That, to a certain explains a lot of the reticence to come back to the office full-time.
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
That's sort of number one. Number 2 is the difference in mindset between baby boomers that I am and young people when it came down to capitalism was pretty dramatic. Baby boomers, 65% of us believe in capitalism, but only 22% of Gen Z believe in capitalism. They would like money, but basically that a lot of young people don't want to grow up to be like the older people, and the older people tell the younger people, shape up, otherwise you're going to not be like us. And they say, we don't want to be like you.
But are those two connected? Because is it that the system is failing them? I don't know how many people want
the idea of how badly the system is failing them. So what tends to happen is people are rejecting all kinds of things, and people think they're rejecting coming back to the office. But that's not what they're rejecting. They're rejecting the system. They're rejecting the boss. They're rejecting a lot of things. And people are trying to, and by basically saying, come back to the office, you know what you're doing? You're basically saying, come back to the one person I don't want to be the boss. Come back to a system that I refuse to accept because the world has changed. So in effect, my whole stuff is, I'm shocked that no one has found out that every time, it's like, like you discover you've got cancer and you decide your cure is going to be to smoke more. Okay, like what the hell's wrong with these people? So that was like that was one big thing that I basically have discovered. The other one that I discovered is how every big leadership company is actually speaking in two tongues, and when they speak in these two tongues, they are losing the plot. Let me give you an example of 3 examples of what two tongues are. Okay. So when you talk to a company, what do they talk about? They talk about agility and personalization. Every company says, my company needs to be agile and I need to personalize.
Closer to the consumer or however they frame it. Yep.
Right. And then they say, by the way, we're going to have a one-size-fit-all model for all our employees. Everybody back to the office 5 days a week.
Because it'll be a better team. It'll build team better.
And my whole basic stuff is, I know how to build teams. You don't need to basically pull people 5 days a week into the office. Give me 1 week every quarter, and I'll build a better team than anybody else in the world. Okay.
But aren't all the best ideas in industry today discovered at the water cooler or standing by the copy machine?
Okay, so that's the second dichotomy.
Oh, sorry.
So that's the first one. Let me give you the second dichotomy.
Yeah.
So as you know, I worked for many, many years at the Publicis Group, and the Publicis Group is about creativity and people coming together and coming up with ideas and all that stuff, right? Okay. So let me tell you this, and this has not changed because I still visit the company. When we needed to do So now when people say come back to the office, they say for the following reasons, 4 following reasons: creativity, sudden chance meetings by the water cooler, which is serendipity, I guess, culture, and training / networking, or, building relationships.
I've heard mentorship as well, right?
Yeah. So let me tell you this. When we wanted to do creative brainstorming, we would leave the office. We'd go to offsite. When we wanted to basically learn, we'd go to Cannes and CES and other conferences. When we wanted to build relationships, we'd go to bars and restaurants. Not a single goddamn thing was done in the goddamn office. Okay? So my whole stuff is, this is total bullshit. Okay, it's total bullshit. So that's the second.
What's it about then? Is it about control?
What do you really think, Rishad? Though I feel like
it's basically about 3 very simple things: the absolute failure of leadership to lead versus coming back to bosses; the absolute failure to reimagine the future versus trying to go back to the past; and third is a basic fear of change, which my first book was about.
Yeah.
Which is the very same people who talk about change don't want to change. The same people who want to reimagine the future don't want to reimagine the future of their firm. And the same people who claim they are leaders are basically control freaks.
Yeah. So one maybe last theme here, and obviously there's a lot more in the book to dig into, but we're clearly seeing an accelerating deployment of all things technological, whether we're talking about Gen AI, agentic AI, robotics, and a whole host of technology. And there's an aspect to that where those technologies are augmenting human capability, but there's also quite a lot of replacing human beings and so forth. When you talk about some of your ideas and when you see the degree to which technology is being deployed at an accelerating rate, what's kind of your take on that? Is that a good thing, a bad thing? Really depends on where you sit.
So what I also did in the book is I did a lot of background research on every time when there was technology, what would happen. So, when the first computers and online came on, Oxford and others did a study by saying 40% of jobs would be destroyed. Nothing like that happened. There were more jobs at the end of it all, right? So every time there's a technology, people say, oh my God, what's going on? Now, with that being said, with the modern rate of technological deployment, including AI, because what happens is AI is the first time the technology has come for the knowledge worker first, right? Versus the blue collar worker. It's really come for the knowledge worker. But I do believe that AI should be called augmented versus, as you mentioned, versus artificial. It augments us. But there are three beliefs I have, and we'll see if this is right. So the last chapter of my book tries to probe into the future. So I basically believe that in the future, companies will be much smaller than they are today. So each company will have fewer jobs. So that sounds horrible. Number two, I believe there are going to be far more companies than there are today. And as a result of the far more companies, there will be far more employment. So I will give you an idea. I believe the modern technology is a slingshot that allows David to compete with Goliath. For $80 a month, I believe I have better AI technology than any company that I go and speak at. And the reason is because $80 a month, actually it's $100 a month, allows me to I subscribe to 5 services, including Anthropic and Google Gemini and OpenAI and others. Most companies only use 1 versus 5 because they want to scale on 1. And most companies, because of safety, utilize the technology of the previous version, which was 6 to 9 months ago, which in most cases tends to be half as good. So I have more technology, twice as good for $100 a month, and I do amazing things with it. And so what basically happens is there is going to be a dramatic shakeout in current firms, including, by the way, consulting firms, law firms, where there are going to be far fewer employees. But it's going to also allow horrible companies like Rishad Tobaccowala LLC, which is a one-person company, to basically, when people go to my LinkedIn and look at my LinkedIn thing, especially as I updated it, they said, how many employees do you have doing all these things? And I said, you're looking at the one employee. Okay. And that is what's going to basically happen. So there is going to be a massive shakeout because and you can see that in technology, how they kick it. Today, the hardest thing to get a job is in technology. If you're a coder, unless you're a world-class coder. I mean, all these things, Amazon, Meta, Google, Microsoft, they're all laying off people really, really fast because they're first using this state-of-the-art technology on themselves. So there is going to be a shakeout, but I believe to survive the shakeout, there will be at the end of it more jobs. But someone in the current job has to basically go and get themselves trained and learn new skills and also become much more flexible about the future of work. And the other thing that I do believe, and that's why one of my chapters is called Fractionalized Employees, is I believe that most companies are going to come to the belief that they actually need maybe all their employees, but all their employees only working 75% of the time or 70% of the time. And they'll say, look, I'm going to pay you 70, 75. I'll give you, and they should say that, I'll give you 75% of benefits, but 100% of healthcare. The other 25%, you do what you want as long as it's competitive. And all of that is so that's one of the driving forces, which is both technology, declining populations, aging populations. They only, for instance, there are a lot of industries that have an ageist thing that when you're old, you get out of there. Well, guess what? Old, which is above 50, has all the money and it's the only group that's growing in population.
Yeah. 100%.
So it's all of those things. So I think it's going to be pretty significant, but it's not just technology. But what I tell person is I don't care who you are, you better go back to school, even if it's the school of YouTube, but get ready.
Right on. Well, our guest is Rishad Tobaccowala, the new book coming out, available today, wherever you love to buy your books, Rethinking Work, Seismic Changes in the Where, When, and Why. If you don't have Rishad's first book, you're missing out. Get that one too. Get those orders together. Rishad, if people want to keep in touch, I subscribe to your fantastic newsletter. You've mentioned a podcast. What's another great way or any other great ways to keep up with what you're thinking?
So I would just say if they buy my book and look at rishad.substack.com or What Next, the podcast, and both the podcast and the book are free. The podcast and the Substack are free. and the book is just $15 or $20, and I get $2.50. So keep the impoverished author fed.
Don't give away the secrets.
The secret sauce.
The powerful economics of selling books.
Exactly.
Right.
So buy a book because it's for all practical purposes free too, and especially based on what hopefully you learn.
Congratulations on the second book, and I wish you safe travels. You travel a lot, so be safe as you travel. And like I said, thanks so much for joining Steve and I on the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
Well, thank you, Steve and Michael, and thank you for having me back.
Thanks for tuning in. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.